cannot keep this a secret any longer. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives.
Techtopia.
Techtopia er en ugenlig podcast om mennesker og deres teknologi, udgivet af Ingeniørforeningen Ida i samarbejde med .dk og Ida Forsikring. Mit navn er Henrik Føns, og det er mig, der bestemmer i
Techtopia.
Kære lytter, velkommen til episode 400 af Techtopia. Techtopia, det betyder jo egentlig stedet, hvor vi taler om teknologi, både utopier, dystopier og det, der ligger lige midt imellem. Nogle gange så taler vi om ting, der sker her og nu, og andre gange kigger vi tilbage i tiden, men for det meste så taler vi om fremtidens teknologi, og altid i lyset af, hvad det betyder for os som mennesker, forskere, iværksættere, opfindere, tænkere, og ikke mindst borgere i et demokrati. Fremtiden, den er lang, medmindre vi lader nutiden gøre den kort. Beslutninger, som vi tager nu, de kan gavne eller tyrannisere mange generationer efter os. Men disse generationer er ufødte. De har ikke nogen stemme i vores nutid. Derfor så må vi gætte eller analysere os frem til, hvad der er bedst for dem, hvilket i høj grad er som at famle rundt i et mørkt lokale med høreværn og bind for øjnene. Men så er det jo godt, at vi har kloge folk, som tænker over, hvordan man kan være en god forfader. En, som fremtidige generationer vil tænke tilbage på med glæde og taknemmelighed. Sådan en tænker er den britiske filosof Roman Krishnarik. Han har skrevet flere bøger, men i denne udgave af Techtopia, der vil vi koncentrere os om bogen How to be a good ancestor. Hvordan er man en god forfader? Men for ligesom at sætte det perspektiv i forhold til teknologien, så lad os starte med en lille konflikt, eller måske rettere sagt en stor konflikt, fra vores egen tech-verden. Rigtig mange af os bruger jo ChatGPT som vores foretrukne AI til opgaver i det daglige. Den er lavet af firmaet OpenAI med direktør og stifter Sam Altman i spidsen. Men hvis man for eksempel er programmør, så foretrækker man måske en AI ved navn Claude, der bliver lavet af et andet amerikansk firma kaldet Anthropic, som har Dario Amodei som leder. Det sagde jeg muligvis forkert. Dario Amodei. Whatever. Det amerikanske forsvarsministerium, der nu kalder sig krigsministerium, forlanger, at de amerikanske AI-virksomheder stiller deres teknologi til rådighed for Pentagon uden betingelser. Men se, det nægter Anthropics CEO Dario Amodei. Han vil ikke tillade, at Claude bliver brugt til automatisk overvågning af amerikanske borgere, som for eksempel analyse af store datamængder, som geolokalisering, webhistorik og økonomiske oplysninger købt fra datamalere. Så vil han heller ikke tillade, at Claude bliver brugt til at håndtere fuldt autonome våben, altså robotter, droner og andre ting i en krigssituation. Anthropic fastholder, at den nuværende AI ikke er pålidelig nok til at kunne tage livsfarlige beslutninger uden menneskelig overvågning, og derfor nægter de at levere en version af Claude, der autonomt kan vælge at angribe mål i en krigssituation. Det medførte her den 27. februar, at præsident Trump han udstedte en ordre om, at alle føderale agenturer, altså alle regeringsinstanser på alle niveauer, skal ophøre med at bruge Anthropics teknologi, efter at virksomheden altså har nægtet at fjerne de her specifikke sikkerhedsforanstaltninger fra Claude. Forsvarsministeriet, eller krigsministeriet som det hedder nu, ledet af krigsminister Pete Hegseth, krævede, at Anthropic gav militæret ubegrænset adgang til Claude til det, han kaldte for alle lovlige formål. Pentagon argumenterede for, at et privat selskab ikke bør have vetoret over militære operationer, og det kan begrænse USA, når det skal rykke hurtigt i militære konflikter, og det var blandt andet Iran og Venezuela, han her tænkte på. Anthropic havde fået en frist til at adlyde. Det var den 27. februar kl. 17, og det nægtede de jo så som bekendt, så kl. 17.01 der tog regeringen nogle hidtil usete skridt. Pentagon stemplede Anthropic som en risiko for forsyningskæden. Det er en betegnelse, som historisk set kun har været benyttet omkring udenlandske virksomheder som kinesiske Huawei eller russiske Kaspersky. Og det betyder, at alle de virksomheder, som er underleverandører til det amerikanske forsvar, det kunne være sådan nogle som overvågningsfirmaet Palantir eller Lockheed Martin, der laver fly, de bliver forhindret i at handle med Anthropic og bruge Anthropics teknologi. Så vedtog man en 6 måneders offboarding-periode. Det betyder, at alle regeringsinstanserne har 6 måneder, altså et halvt år til at fjerne Claude fra deres systemer. Og så kun få timer efter, at forbuddet blev annonceret, der underskrev konkurrenten OpenAI en stor kontrakt med Pentagon. Det havde den konsekvens, at Claude blev den mest populære gratis app i App Store, fordi folk begyndte at forlade ChatGPT. Der var sådan en quit-GPT-reaktion fra forbrugerne. Anthropic er så ved at forberede et retsligt efterspil. Og hvis vi så vender tilbage til vores tema for i dag, nemlig det med at være en god forfader, så kunne det jo tyde på, at der er en masse mennesker, inklusive dem, som laver Claude, der ikke ønsker, at deres efterkommere skal leve i en tid, hvor AI ikke er kontrolleret i tilstrækkelig grad. Et andet mere fredeligt, men måske lige så alvorligt eksempel er vores snarlige folketingsvalg, for hvem bør egentlig stemme om fremtiden? Er det os, eller er det vores børn? Se, det tog Roman Krishnarik og hans hustru konsekvensen af, og det fortæller han om her.
So one thing my wife and I did in 2019 is we decided to give our children, who were then 11 years old, we decided to give them our votes. So we all sat around the kitchen table and discussed the party manifestos and the political policies, and they told us where to put the X, put the mark on the ballot sheet. So in a way, what we were trying to do there was give them a chance to have their futures represented in the political system. To me, the idea of future generations feels a bit abstract, feels a bit far away, a bit out there, whereas being a good ancestor is about you and me, it's about us, it's about the responsibilities that we have, and how will we be remembered by the generations to come. That's what being a good ancestor is all about. And I think it's so fundamental because it's clear we live in a very short-term world. The tyranny of the now is supreme, that our politicians can't see beyond the next election. Businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report. We're looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. And it's obvious that there are so many multiple long-term challenges in society, whether it's dealing with wealth inequality that gets passed on from generation to generation, or dealing with the next pandemic that's coming our way, or thinking about the risks of AI or genetic engineering, or the slow violence of the ecological crisis, which is here right now, of course, in floods and fires and melting ice sheets, but it'll get worse year on year, decade on decade. So we need a longer view. And the problem, in a way, is that I think we've colonized the future. We treat the future as a dumping ground for technological risks and ecological degradation, as if there was nobody there. And the book I wrote, The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World, is all about how do we try and step into the shoes of those future generations? How do we empathize through time? And it's not easy. If you go to Wales in the UK, they have a new public position, a political position called the Future Generations Commissioner, who's not elected, it's a public official, but the job of the Future Generations Commissioner is to make sure that public policy in all areas, education, healthcare, transport, environment, has positive impacts or protects the generations 30 years from today. Now that position, they don't have a lot of power, it's more kind of soft power, but it's been used very, very effectively to create a new public conversation when they're doing road building or transport changes, education changes. There's a public discussion about how's this going to impact future generations. And in a way, it is about changing the conversation of our, how our politics is run, how our economies are run.
I know you have other examples also from Japan, for instance.
Yes, in Japan they have this amazing organization called Future Design, where what they do is they invite local people in a town or city to draw up plans for the place where they live, and they typically divide them into two groups. Half are told that they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these sort of orange ceremonial robes to wear and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out the residents from 2060 come up with much more transformative plans for their towns or cities, whether they're talking about water infrastructure or thinking about the problems of an aging population or the risks of AI or climate risks. Just by dressing up, in a sense, enables them to switch on what I think of as their acorn brains, that part of their brain which is all about long-term thinking and planning. So I think more of that could be easily instigated.
Has our future become shorter during, for instance, our lifetime?
Actually, I think our futures have become shorter over the last 500 years. It's been a long process. It began in the 13th century with one of the great engineering innovations, which was the invention of the mechanical clock, which started chiming. Those first clocks used to just chime or bong once every hour or every 15 minutes. But by 1600, most clocks started having minute hands. By 1800, they started having second hands. Of course, now we've got nanosecond speed share trading, but over time, as time has been sliced up and sped up, in a way, we've lost sight of the future. Now, so what I'm trying to say here is that we often think that the future's almost sort of disappeared in our time, that we've been, in the last few years or decades, we've become addicted to our phones. But actually, this is part of a much longer process, which has reached extreme proportions now, where we, find it hard to get away from the dopamine addiction of our scrolling fingers.
I remember the French philosopher Paul Virilio talked about that we were being reduced to the finger clicking and the eye looking because our minds and our thoughts were traveling at the speed of light through the internet.
Yeah, I think Virilio really helped us understand the problem of accelerationism. In a sense, the acceleration of society, which in a way has become an ideology, like in Silicon Valley. There are people who say we need to accelerate everything faster. That we need to have AI faster. I don't believe that, actually. I think we need to do the opposite, because we are on a kind of road to recklessness. Because as we know, the way that, if you think about the big AI companies, they're driven by fear. Fear that if they don't release the next model before the opposition or before China, they're going to lose market share, they're going to lose profits, they're going to lose investors. And of course, the casualty of that strategy is safety. We're having the models released in ways that you would never release drugs, medical, drugs. You have to go through clinical testing, publicly approved. And we don't have this when it comes to the new AI models. And so in a way, it's a long-term problem. We're not thinking about those long-term consequences on society.
But then again, if you look at the COVID crisis, it was apparently quite good that we could develop a medicine quite quickly.
Yeah, we managed to do it quickly, and we did that in a moment of crisis. And of course, some of the medicines were developed in the private sector, but a lot of them were done through governments and government, support, or governments sometimes buying into biotech companies and things like that. And, everything still had to be tested fast, but it was, in most countries, everything was tested in the public sphere and by governments. And there were very strong regulations on the kinds of things that drugs that could be used, the vaccines and things like that. And I don't think we do anything quite like that when it comes to AI. I'd be very happy. I wouldn't mind if AI came into the world fast if it was very highly regulated. And I think we need to realize that regulation is something that is not the opposite of innovation, that you can have innovation within limits, within regulations. If you think about, let's say, Mozart composed on a 5-octave piano, or Jimi Hendrix played on a 5-string guitar, you can have creativity, you can have innovation within limits, and we shouldn't be afraid of that.
Do you have any examples of companies or people who have been good ancestors?
Yeah, I think you can look through history and see companies, organizations that in a way have been good ancestors, which are thinking very, very long term. Think, for example, of the British pharmaceutical company Faith in Nature. Now legally have a seat for the living world, for nature and future generations on the board. In other words, they're not just about making profits, they also have to take into account the impacts of their actions on future generations and on ecosystems. And so there's those kinds of models, or another kind of model is a company like Patagonia, where the shares are basically held in a trust, which means that they're escaping from the short-term cycles of shareholder capitalism, of just being ruled by the share price or the quarterly report. And I think these are kind of good ancestor companies in a way. And I think what's important about them, it's not that they've got great leaders. great leaders help. It's actually the deep design of the organizations themselves, that they are designed not just for pure profit making, but maybe they have triple or quadruple bottom line accounting and things like that. And so this is where I think we see good ancestry in action.
In your book and in your talks, you also talk about the Danish company Ørsted, which is making windmill parks. I guess you could also call it in English. How are they being a good ancestor?
I think Ørsted's a really interesting example because, of course, originally they were the Danish oil and national gas company, Dong, I think, and then about 2008, 2009, they embarked on what was called the 85-15 plan, where they were shifting from 85% fossil fuel production and 15% renewable and trying to switch that around. And within, I think, about 10 years, they managed to change that ratio to become 85% renewable, and that's when they changed their name to Ørsted. And what I really like about that example, two things really. Firstly, it was an example of what might call cathedral thinking, this sort of long-term vision. In fact, it happened much faster than expected. I think they thought it would take about 30 years to make this change. In fact, they did it in about 10, as I said. The other reason I like this example is my understanding was that this was a really difficult process. It was messy. There were huge arguments internally and with the government and things like that. And I think that's the reality, that none of this stuff, these kinds of transitions are not easy. But if you have the vision of where you're trying to go to, then I think there are possibilities for change.
But if you have an idea like this and it goes on for a very long time, well, this hasn't been going on for such a long time, but some decades, and then someone comes along and destroys it, like President Trump is now trying to destroy actually the business of Ørsted and destroying the projects that they're doing. So how do you actually protect long-term visions in the future?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? That makes me think about engineering, actually, the way that, let's say structural or civil engineers, they will build a bridge so that it's not going to fall down in 10 years, but it's going to last 100 years. Or cathedral builders, they're building a building that's going to last for centuries, and sometimes it in fact does take centuries to build. There are certain things like that, physical infrastructure, which is quite hard to dismantle, but equally, of course, there are other areas where a government, Trump or whoever, can change regulations or in whatever way, and things can fall apart very quickly. How do you protect those things? I mean, sometimes you can protect them through legal mechanisms. So I've been very much in favor of supporting organizations fighting for the rights of future generations, constitutional rights, or the rights of nature. Like in New Zealand, rivers have rights. The Wanganui River, sacred to Maori people, has rights. Or in Spain, there's a lake called the Mar Menor, which has the legal rights of a person, so it gets protected by the legal system. But ultimately, I think if we're going to, prevent, right-wing populist governments or whatever dismantling social, economic, political structures, we need to, in a way, be on the streets. I mean, we need social movements. We need to recognize that all through history, that these kinds of rights that we have and protections or health systems and education systems have been emerged from social struggles, people fighting for things to try and protect them.
But don't you need sort of like a common ground for what it means to be a good ancestor? Because I'm actually quite sure that someone like Trump thinks he is a good ancestor in what he is doing, although we would disagree with him.
Yeah, it actually makes me think I remember coming across this quote from a former head of Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, who said, "We're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy." Now, I don't think that's being a good ancestor. It's a very sort of narrow form of thinking about the future, and I imagine Trump is quite similar. But I think it is really important to think about how one communicates the idea of being a good ancestor to people from different political backgrounds. I remember once giving a speech in the Dutch Senate to senators from many, many different parties, left and right and middle, green and not green. And one of the things I emphasized when I spoke to them, I said, look, if you think for a moment, if you've got children, let's say, and a lot of them do, your child, if they're young now, they could be alive in the year 2100. That future isn't science fiction, it's an intimate family fact. And wherever you are on the political spectrum, that child in the future is going to need basic things we all agree on. They're going to need water to drink, food to eat, air to breathe. There's a common denominator. And so if you care about your child's life or your grandchild's life, then in a way you need to care about all life. You need to care about the integrity of the planet. And that's what I always end up coming back to, that no matter who you are or where you come back from, even though the future is uncertain, is AI going to destroy humanity? I don't know. But what I do know is that human beings are always going to need these basics to live, a kind of a functioning ecology. And so for me, whether I'm thinking about politics or economics or technology or engineering or art or whatever it is, the kind of big circle that surrounds us is the biosphere. Everything has to be consistent with that. That's kind of what I've eventually come to understand.
If you want to become a good ancestor, for instance, one of my listeners, or I would like to be a good ancestor, what is the one thing I should start by doing tomorrow or today?
I think tomorrow morning, when you're brushing your teeth, after you finish, look yourself in the mirror and ask, what can I do to be a good ancestor today? I think it's actually kind of an existential issue about asking who we are. Or you could go at the end of the day and say, what have I done to be a good ancestor? I think it's about a habit of thinking. I could say, yes, you should go and protest on the streets against the government's glacial pace of action on the climate change. I've done that with my teenage daughter, but that's not for everyone. For other people, they're doing it by being a social entrepreneur. Others are doing it in different kinds of ways, by working with parents from the local school to put solar panels on the roof. In a way, it doesn't matter. I think what matters is doing things with other people. If someone says to me, what can I do as an individual? I might say, be less of an individual. Do something with others to be a good ancestor, and keep that question, how can I be a good ancestor today, in your mind, in your mental back pocket.
And today I did an interview with you.
Yes, well, I don't know if that's going to help create a world of good ancestry, but we're all trying in our own little ways to do it. So thank you.
One more thing, actually. Now you mentioned the individual. How does the the idea about individualism fit into this?
I think we need to escape from the hyper-individualism of the 20th century, which we've inherited from neoliberal economics and the self-help industry, from Sigmund Freud to Oprah Winfrey, where the question that we ask ourselves is, who am I? So the question we ask ourselves is, who am I? And I think we need to shift from an individual question to a collective question, which is, who are we? What can we do together? We need to shift from individual values to more collective values, because we cannot solve the problems of our time, whether it's AI risks or the climate emergency, things like that, unless we work together. This is how we get through turbulence.
Og det sagde altså den britiske filosof Roman Krishnarik. Vi slipper ham ikke helt, fordi han har nemlig også et meget sjovt og poetisk projekt, som han går rundt og roder med. Det er sådan et helt særligt museum, som jeg egentlig også lige synes fortjener at blive nævnt i nogle minutter, selvom det falder lidt uden for det generelle tema.
It's an extraordinary thing. It's run by proper artists. I'm just the founder of it. And it's a museum invented to enable people to look at the world through the eyes of others. So one of our exhibits is called A Mile in My Shoes, and it's a giant shoebox. You can walk inside. It's the world's first empathy shoe shop, and you go in, and someone will fit you with a pair of shoes belonging to a stranger. It could be a Syrian refugee, or a tech optimist from Silicon Valley, or a Buddhist monk, or an environmental activist, and you can literally walk a mile in their shoes while listening to an audio narrative of them talking about their life in their words. And wherever we go, we collect new shoes and stories, from Belgium to Brazil.
And where's this museum situated?
It travels around the world. So it's just been in New York at New York University. It's going to Montreal. Next it'll be somewhere in the UK. So it goes wherever there are stories to listen to and tell, which is anywhere in the world.
So do you actually travel around with all these shoes, and how many shoes are we talking about?
There's over 1,000 pairs of shoes. And I personally, I don't always travel around with it. It goes around with the curation team and the producers, but I sometimes go to it. I remember going to it when it first opened with my little kids, who just loved hearing these different stories. But it's for anybody. It's what it does is it does something fundamental that we need in society, which is to create social cohesion in a highly polarized world, partly because of digital technologies and algorithms dividing us from each other, where we're just listening to the same stories, reinforcing our views. We need to create cultural tolerance and trust, and empathy. Looking at the world through other people's eyes is one of the ways that we do this. So it's a kind of artistic antidote to the almost technological problems of our time.
So how do you get the shoes? I mean, do you contact people and ask them to donate their shoes, or do they do it voluntarily?
Yeah, absolutely. People do it voluntarily. So we try and curate shoes from a very wide variety of sectors. So sometimes we might do a project on migration, and we'll talk to refugees or migrants who will come and do an interview with our audio producers, maybe talk for a couple of hours about their life, their turning points in their life, their thoughts and feelings, and then it's edited down to about 10 or 12 minutes, quite short. And then they donate a pair of shoes. Maybe it's the shoes that they came on a boat on, whatever it happens to be. So it's a very intimate experience. You almost feel like you're inside somebody's skin when you're listening to their voice and you've got their shoes on your feet.
Amazing. How many shoes have you tried?
Me personally? At least 50 pairs. I mean, probably more. And I've met a lot of the people whose shoes I've worn, which is another dimension of it. I mean, I think this is all about how do we create new conversations in society? How do we get new perspectives? How do we get out of our own silos? Sort of trapped in our own small worlds.
Jeg linker til Roman Krishnarik fra Techtopia.dk, hvor du også kan finde tidligere episoder af Techtopia. Du kan skrive til mig på henrik@techtopia.dk, og du kan finde os på diverse sociale medier, hvor vi hedder @techtopia.dk, og så kan du også finde os på LinkedIn. Jeg hedder Henrik Føns, og jeg får hjælp af Anders Bredstorff, og tilbage er der kun at sige på genhør i næste uge, og må fremtiden være med dig.
We cannot keep this a secret any longer. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives.
Techtopia.
Techtopia er en ugenlig podcast om mennesker og deres teknologi, udgivet af Ingeniørforeningen IDA i samarbejde med .dk og IDA Forsikring. Mit navn er Henrik Føns, og det er mig, der bestemmer i
Techtopia.
You are interested in the unknown, the mysterious, the unexplainable. That is why you are here. And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.